Welcome to the next episode of the podcast on negotiation. And today we will have a very special guest with us, Alisher Faizullaev, who is a political scientist, psychologist, professor, scholar, teacher, negotiation professor, negotiation trainer, and also a former diplomat. We will talk about diplomacy and negotiation. My name is Remy Smolinski, and welcome to the next episode of the podcast on negotiation. Alisher, it's great to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, Remy. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor.
Alisher, you're a diplomat, negotiator, scholar, professor. I would like us to start a little bit with the link between diplomacy and negotiation. It seems to be obvious, but I was wondering how you felt, how you lived this link in your career as the ambassador to the United Kingdom, Benelux countries, NATO, and the EU, right?
Right, and NATO as well.
So how did you live? How did you live the link between negotiation and diplomacy? How was it embedded in your daily work as a diplomat?
Well, I was born in Tashkent, and I have a scholarly background. I have degrees in psychology and also in political science, but I never thought that I would become a diplomat. But when we got independence, so government, we had a very few diplomats in Uzbekistan, and government asked people like me and some other scholars with some foreign language command to join the government and serve the country as a diplomat. First, I said no, because I had no idea what is diplomacy, and I had some other plans. But then when I started to think about the future of my country, some challenges, I said yes, and I joined, and I spent 10 years in diplomacy. But then I came back to academia. So now I'm not an acting diplomat. So I was a diplomat, I was an ambassador, but now I'm a scholar. So when you ask me about a combination of my scholarship and activity as a trainer and teacher and expert in negotiation, so you need to know a little bit about my background on the one hand. So, but on the other hand, I think it's a perfectly good combination when you have a kind of background in psychology, in political science, in diplomacy, and experience in teaching and training. So it could be a very good combination to bring all these aspects, scholarly aspect, diplomatic aspects, and teaching, training aspects. So now I try to combine this. What else? How? If you ask how, please go ahead with your questions.
Yes, absolutely. I was wondering, so you were thrown by the government, with your consent, obviously, into the deep waters of diplomacy. Yes, and I was wondering how you tackled this issue. So how to become a skilled diplomat, especially if we just embark on this journey.
Well, different countries, of course, have different some practices of preparation, promotion of diplomats. Most countries in the world, especially in Europe now, they have only so-called career diplomats. So you, after graduation from university, you enter diplomatic service, and step by step you become a diplomat, senior diplomat, ambassador for many years. But some countries, especially United States, is famous with appointment of political appointees as ambassadors. So we could see that there are different paths to become ambassador. But in our case, in case of newly established state, so we just needed to have someone who could do some kinds of work. So we started from scratch. So I am very happy that I spent some time in diplomacy and helped to build up our diplomatic service, diplomatic missions abroad, again from scratch. So of course, a lot of things were quite new. So a lot of things I've learned, not just me, but some others at that time. But now in Uzbekistan and many other former Soviet republics, newly independent countries, we already have these career diplomats who devoted themselves to diplomacy. They think about become a diplomat ambassadors. But we faced a lot of interesting, very challenging time, and we had to learn. For example, just tell you one little story to imagine, for you to just to imagine what kinds of situation we had some time ago. When I arrived in Brussels in 1995 to open up our embassy in Brussels, we had no any banking connections to transfer of banking. So we had some money with us, cash we brought. We immediately went to one bank. We said, well, we are diplomats. We want to open an account and put our money here. And they asked, which country? I said, Uzbekistan. Pakistan? What country? So, and they've been very suspicious. They didn't open any account. We went to another bank, and we had a problem with that. Then I went to Foreign Office, asked them, would you please help us to open an account? And they gave us a letter that they represent officially a country, so please help them to open an account. So finally, we've been able to open an account. But you see what kinds of time we experienced. They copied all our monies, and I had to sign all them. In any case, so to check this is real money or not. So we faced a lot of these kinds of problem when we started our diplomatic work from zero, nothing. So no any embassy, no any premises, no any car, no nothing, from zero. And of course that was very challenging, but very, very good experience and a lot of learning. So it's a kind of on-spot learning, and sometimes you can learn a lot when you go through these kinds of experiences. So it's a very good training for diplomats. So you learn, and I guess because the essence of diplomacy, it's a mostly social work. Of course, analytical work, some many different aspects, but you need to be communicator. You need to analyze, you need to observe, you need to deliver some message. You need to make a contact and communicate, negotiate, have a conversation, and you will be quite all right.
Thank you, Alisher, for sharing those early time stories of Uzbek diplomacy. I was wondering, throughout your 10 years of your diplomatic career, have you experienced negotiations that required from you, the best of your negotiation skills, something that you look back with a smile, with a sense of accomplishment? Any stories come to your mind, maybe, as we speak?
Right. Well, of course, when you spend so many years in diplomacy, I spent 10 years, you, of course, obviously will have a lot of different and difficult and funny different situations. But I'd like to stress one element of diplomatic negotiations, which is usually if we discuss state-based diplomacy, international diplomacy, I mean diplomacy between states, not just diplomacy in everyday life, but official diplomacy, when negotiators are official representatives of states. So we need to understand that you as a diplomat, as an individual, you are just very one important but small part of the whole process. There is a state. For example, if in United Nations somebody vote for something in United Nations General Assembly, for example, it's not a person who votes, it's a country who votes, right? So there are countries, when we say relationship between America and United States, it's not relationship just between individuals, but between states. So there is a state. Then there is a states institutions or agencies like Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then you as an individual who represent states on the field, you are a field player. So you could be extremely good as a negotiator, but without backing, without some statehood or organizational backing, you may be not very good. Or you may have a weak state, but a very good negotiator. That would strengthen state. So I'll tell you maybe one or two stories when maybe not very successful, but which it seems to me may characterize one of the aspects of diplomatic negotiations. So you need to be very strategic. So sometimes you may fail, but it is very important to step in order to advance some of your interests and to broaden perspectives and have a better perspective for future. I remember in 1995, 1996, we negotiated with European Union. I was an ambassador to European Union, and we negotiated an agreement, partnership and cooperation agreement with the European Union. That's a very good agreement, very complex agreement. There are some political, trade, economic, environmental, different aspects of that. And I wanted to present some more broader, some perspective and to have some, how to say, more ambitious agreement. And I said, why not to discuss a free trade agreement between Uzbekistan and the European Union? And they just laughed and said, well, no. Sorry, it's not a time. By the way, we still don't have a free trade agreement, but I think it was very important to push forward and to set up some goals. And next day I brought some letters between Amir Timur, who was a ruler of Mavaranahar, place where Uzbekistan now situated, one of our great kings or rulers, emperor. So he had at the beginning of 15th century, he had a correspondence between Amir Timur and several European kings, like Henry IV of England, King of England, and Charles VI of France. And they discussed free trade between Tamerlane's empire and France and England, protecting traders, all this stuff. And I said, look, our great ancestors, they already discussed these things. Why not to discuss us now, all these things? Well, they've been surprised, said, well, maybe in the future. But I believe, of course, I didn't succeed. It was not successful attempt from my side, but I believe it helped us to broaden some perspective. The same happened, for example, when I went to European Investment Bank, EIB, and proposed, let's discuss a relationship with Uzbekistan. So I said, no, we don't have mandate. It's too early. But now we already have a good relationship. The same with NATO. I said it was mid-90s. Why not to discuss Afghanistan? Because it's a very worrying situation. So we need to discuss. We are a partner country, partner for peace country. So they said, no, we don't discuss Afghanistan in NATO. So now, NATO was a very big player there also. So the point is, even when you may fail in diplomatic negotiation as an individual, as a field player, but sometimes it's even more important strategically, when you put something ahead, forward, and from time to time you are coming back again, negotiation, and putting a little bit more forward, and again. So in fact, the diplomatic, one of the very important characteristics of diplomatic negotiations, it's its complexity. There are many aspects, so many applications. So you need to take care of all of them and to be strategic, to think about the future. But for that, you need to prepare very well, to go to the history, as I did, for example, taking the letters between kings, or think about some possible future economic project. But again, preparation. That's one of the very important characteristics of diplomatic negotiation. Of course, any negotiation needs to have preparation, but in diplomacy, this is especially very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alisher, for sharing this. Absolutely amazing. You published recently. You published a book called "Diplomacy for Professionals and Everyone." Yeah?
Right.
And I was wondering, hey, that looks great. I still need to get one. But I did go through your preface and did look at the table of content and found it super interesting. And I was wondering, who is this book? What is this book all about? And who is it for? Is it for diplomats? Is it for everyone? What is it all about? And who is it for?
Right. Well, thank you very much for bringing this issue to our conversation. It's a pleasure to talk about your just recently published book. As you see, Diplomas for Professionals and Everyone. That's it seems to be quite an interesting combination. Usually, perhaps it's not a usual thing to combine two perspectives. So professional perspective, it's a professional. But when you talk about diplomacy for everyone, this gives quite a different perspective. But I believe this book, I hope, would be interesting for professional diplomats, for those who study diplomacy, those who are interested in diplomacy, and for everyone who want to practice some diplomacy, some kinds of diplomacy, bring some diplomatic ideas and diplomatic, methods to their social life, to everyday situation, to social interactions. So I strongly believe that there is not only international traditional diplomacy, which is mostly politically motivated. Of course, international diplomacy may have different driving forces or imperatives. So interest-based or political imperatives, social imperatives, relationship imperative, which is relationship, or moral imperatives. So value-based, it could be, or legal imperatives, rights-based. But traditional diplomacy is mostly about politics. It's a part of foreign policy, international politics. But when we talk about diplomacy for wider audience, for everybody, for social diplomacy, here the first thing is it is focused on engagement, interaction, relationship building, because social is essentially, it is about interaction, engagement, connections, relationship building. So I was talking about in this book about the essence, methods, for functions, and many other aspects of traditional diplomacy, but at the same time comparing this with social diplomacy. The interesting thing just recently happened and happening in diplomatic studies, which is diplomacy now. A lot of diplomatic scholars consider diplomacy not just as a kind of political instrument of the states, but as a social practice. So I call this as a social turn in diplomatic studies. So we could, for many years, most scholars approach diplomas from historical perspectives or from political perspectives as a kind of tool in international politics. But we could look at diplomacy as a social practice. So as an instrument of which could help us to live peacefully, to exist with others, and which could be practiced not just by states, but by any social actors like individuals, companies, organizations, groups, states, and the combinations. So this is about these kinds of diplomacies as well. Social diplomacy in our everyday life, in our social life, and political diplomacy. And of course, one of my conclusions that these kinds of diplomacy could learn from each other. Of course, international traditional diplomacy accumulated a very huge experience, very important some things we could learn from it. But traditional or professional diplomats also could learn from good diplomats in social life. Perhaps we all know some people who could deserve to be called as a very good diplomat in just everyday situations. Of course, they could also, professions could learn from everyday people's social interactions.
Alisher, speaking of learning, I was wondering, how to become a great social diplomat. Yes, based on the wealth of your experience as a diplomat, active diplomat yourself, yes, and as a negotiation professor, someone who teaches others how to negotiate well. What are the bases? What are the key success factors for everyday social diplomats?
Right. Well, a few things I would like to point to. Number one, usually, traditionally, we consider diplomacy as a mission. So we use this word quite often in traditional diplomacy, like some country could send to other country a mission, or embassy as a mission, diplomatic mission. So, or even in history, in many thousands years ago, one ruler could send a mission, diplomatic mission, to another ruler. So it could be trade mission, which also at the same time accomplish diplomatic mission. So as far as social diplomacy at individual level, so we also could consider social diplomacy as a kind of mission. It is a goodwill mission. So in order to be a good social diplomat, you need to take up this mission of goodwill. So it's very important to have this aspirational aspect of this diplomacy. Diplomacy is a peaceful endeavor. It is a mission which help others and yourself to live peacefully, to coexist. So If you think that you are ready to take this mission, you want to take up this mission, you become a great social diplomat. That's the beginning. You need to consider this as a mission, but it's not enough. Mission is a good thing, but you also need to have a diplomacy is about engagement. You need to engage. So engagement, no diplomacy could happen without engagement, but not any kinds of engagement. War is also engagement, but with a diplomacy, different engagement. It is a constructive engagement. You have to construct something. So construction here is a result. It's a social good. So when we talk about social diplomacy, it's a mission based on constructive engagement and dialogical interaction, which aims to create some social good. But mostly here we talk about relationship building. In case of traditional diplomacy, it is related to governance, power distribution. It's a part of political whole activity, political sphere. But here, first of all, it takes care about relationship. So it doesn't matter who you are. Maybe you are a bad guy, but I'd like to understand you. I'd like to listen to you. I'd like to engage with you in conversation. So to know your mindset. So to set up some relationship. And this may help not only to create some working or good personal relationship, but to resolve problems, to solve problems, to resolve conflict, etc. One of the interesting differences, in my opinion, between traditional diplomacy and social diplomacy, in traditional diplomacy, negotiation is one of the main instruments. Perhaps it's its essence. It's the core of traditional diplomacy. So when we say diplomacy, it is about negotiation. So it is, I call it, it seems in my book, I considered two the so-called mega functions of traditional diplomacy. One is negotiation. The second is representation. So anything traditional diplomats, especially ambassadors, do, it is related to negotiation. Sometimes not just to negotiation. I consider negotiation more explicit process with structure, but to bargaining. You may not always negotiate, but you always bargain as a diplomat. But when we go to social diplomacy, it is not just negotiation. Negotiation could take part, it may have a role, but the much more important thing is conversation. So conversation becomes the main instrument of social diplomacy, relationship building instrument. So you have to be good conversationalist. As in case of traditional diplomacy, you have to be a good negotiator. So, but all, of course, when we talk about dialogical interaction, as I mentioned earlier, so I usually could point to several elements of this dialogical interactions, like conversation, as we already discussed, negotiation, and rhetoric, and also debate. So if I would like to have some debate with you, or just speak publicly, but do it as a part of my dialogue with you, not just one-sided. I talk, you listen. No, it's a part of our dialogue. In this case, it could be part of dialogical interaction. But again, the most important instrument of social diplomacy or everyday diplomacy, it is conversation.
That's super interesting, and I've been listening very carefully to the extract of the key success factors in social diplomacy. Mm-hmm. I was wondering why nobody teaches our kids, how to become great conversationalists, right? It seems that that the education system just assumes blindly that it's there, but it isn't, right? This is a skill, something that we can learn, right? What is your experience with conversationalists? Are those people who have the talent, natural talent to do that, or is it possible for anyone, for any one of us to learn how to become a good social diplomat and a good conversationalist?
Well, first, I fully agree with you about learning some important things or not learning some important things at school or even at university. So I could widen this list and put some other very important stuff like career planning, just breathing, relaxation, meditation. All these things are very important in life, but unfortunately, no school teach us while they're teaching some maybe not very important things at the same time. So, of course, conversation and, of course, negotiation as well are very, very important life skills. So not just for diplomats, traditional or social diplomat, but for everyone. So, unfortunately, we don't teach. But interestingly, I consider myself as a constructivist, social constructivist. So when you approach to education, to your classes, to your interaction with students as a social construction, it inevitably becomes a part of conversational learning. So you are not up above of your students and teach them something from your high. So you are entering in conversation, you're learning from your students, and they are learning from you. You're learning together. That's a part of conversation. So education itself could be a part of conversation. And constructivist approach to education, it's like just approach to as a conversation. This, as far as could people learn or some born extremely good genius conversationals? That's perhaps a very interesting rhetoric question. Of course, we could see in real life some very, very nice conversationalists. When I teach some classes about conversation, I usually ask my students, could you put down a few people who you think they're great conversationalists? Always anybody could put at least few people they consider absolutely wonderful conversationalists. It may be their parents or some relatives or friends, etc. But everybody know there are a lot of very good conversationalists in our life. So not because they want to be conversational, but because it is a nice skill. It's a nice feeling. It's you could create some social good through conversation. So, but at the same time, of course, it could be a part of learning process. You could teach, you could learn conversation, especially when you put it like you need to have a aspiration, some goodwill, not just conversational, kind of Machiavellical kind of, I do conversation, but my thought and my aim is a little different. So sometimes I take my student to bazaar to do some negotiation trainings. I ask them usually to do 3 exercises in bazaar. They bring a little money. First exercise, I ask them to get some bargaining and buy something, little stuff like an apple or something like that. Usually it's a typical bargaining. Sellers say one price, buyers say one other price, and they somehow come to middle and get a deal. Second, I ask them to start from very, very unexpectedly, extremely low price. That's a very unpleasant experience. Sellers become very furious. They say very bad things. Usually when they say, for example, for 10,000 something, And these guys say, well, one son, very one penny or 1 cent, they become crazy. But I do this because I like students to get some experience of this. And usually they very rarely come to conclusion, but after that, that's a one-time experience. After they don't want to they don't want to see each other. They turn back to each other. That's it. That's a one-time deal. And third exercise, I like them to feel that you may win, but you will lose a person. You will never get any relationship with him further. But the most interesting, the most powerful experience they get when I ask them, don't do any bargaining. Just set up people-to-people relationship. Try to understand, get some conversation with the sellers. Usually, not everybody will like to do, but some of them do this with very pleasure. These sellers, because very few people approach them as from conversation point of view, as a person. They see them as a seller. So we need to struggle to do some haggling. But here, don't lie. Don't be manipulative. Don't think about buying something, selling something. Just do some nice people-to-people conversation. Try to understand, try to feel. You know what happens usually? It's fantastic. In most cases, these people are giving something to students. They don't ask them to give something. Take 2 kilos of my apple. No. I have my nephew as you student. I'd like to help you. No. I don't want to buy something. I just want to say hello to you. Just have a little conversation. So they feel very appreciation, very big happiness. They are ready to return something. The investment to people relationship. So even in bazaar, in haggling place, so you may manage to have some people-to-people relationship without anything, and that gives some very powerful feeling. So you could learn even in bazaar to set up some human relationship and just have a good conversation without negotiation, without bargaining, without haggling.
Alisher, thank you so much for your inspiration. My business school is located very close to a bazaar, and I'm very much tempted to, I will be teaching in 2 weeks. I'm very much tempted to send these students over across the street and make them negotiate. But speaking of conversations, conversationalists, and storytelling, I think you've shared in one of our earlier conversations, you've shared that you used to teach a course on negotiation and fairy tales, or negotiating in fairy tales. Right. I cannot finish this podcast episode without asking you at least one question about this course. What can we learn about negotiation from fairy tales?
Right. Well, first, of course, we could see negotiation everywhere. So as a negotiation professor, you know this very well. So everywhere. So at home, at street, at the office, etc., etc. But one of the very, very interesting area to study negotiation, it's fairy tales, it's legends, myth. So part of my course was, I taught it several times to psychology students, negotiation in myth, in legends and fairy tales. So, and we've learned a lot. And I was myself quite surprised to learn very interesting things from just children's books, fairy tales, folk stories. So One of the most striking part of studying these fairy tales from negotiation perspective is that, so on the one hand, as a negotiation professors, of course, we teach win-win approaches, some nice ideas, bringing some niceness to social good, as I just myself described before. All these things, all these ideas are very nice and, of course, very constructive, and we need to continue pushing towards these kinds of good direction of negotiation practices and theories. But very interesting and quite unexpected thing for me was that in many, many fairy tales, most negotiations are distributive negotiations. One side wins, the other side loses. So that was quite surprising for me. Even one of my students, she said, well, now I would be very careful to give to my children fairy tale books, because I see that in most cases, these people who have cunning, who is with wit, with strategic approach, as we may also say, and also smartness, but not just with a good heart and all the things. They win. So why especially cunning is so huge in fairy tale negotiations? I was myself quite a little bit surprised why we are giving all the stories to our children, and we think that they're learning some nice things. So, but in most cases, it's just a personage with nice cunning skills are winning in many stories.
Does it mean, Alisher, that we have to write new fairy tales with win-win and principle-based approach?
No. The thing, it seems to me a little bit different. The thing is, we need to, even in reading cunning, wit, we need to be very careful and put it in a much more, how to say, sensitive, more culturally rich background. So when you say just cunning, it is like something not very nice thing. But when people like Nasreddin Afandi, Hoja Afandi, who is a very big folk hero in many Eastern countries, like in Uzbekistan, we consider him, we like him very much. He is a hero. And he is one of the absolutely fantastic negotiators. And he used quite often his not just his creativity, his ability to solve problems, his fantastic wit, all the things, but cunning as well. So how this? But in order to understand this, why people like him, in order to understand it, you need to put in a social context. When he uses, or some other heroes from fairy tales uses, against whom they use, what kinds of some element, very tiny little aspect of this cunning happens there. So when we are more careful, we need to understand, well, first, life is very complicated. In life, we may see many not pleasant situations. There are so many people who are ready to apply some manipulative approaches. You have to be very careful. You have to be prepared. You have to have a wit. You have to have some skills to stop them, to against the plot, all the things. So in this context, these fairy tale stories become some, they have some positive very elements as well. Not it is just about cunning, about some deception, but it is for making some social good. But also they teach not just perhaps many negotiation professors like consider life from this win-win point of view. They teach us that in life there are many situations you have to be very careful. There are a lot of people who want to deceive you, want to apply to you some very not nice things. You have to learn this, and fairy tales teach us these things, and that they are very good sources of learning negotiation, real life negotiation. They are representing real life, not just it's a nice thing.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing this. Definitely have to look a little bit deeper into it. And I'm super glad that you've mentioned Hoxha Nasruddin. He is the hero of my youth. Yeah.
Oh.
I read all stories or books that I could access in my library growing up. I completely understand the fascination of many nations with him and his legacy. But when we think about people like him, great, skillful negotiators. Yes, given that what you've experienced so far in diplomacy, but also in research and teaching, the negotiation and diplomacy, and also psychology, right? You're a psychologist by training. If you were to name great negotiators, skilled negotiators, who comes to your mind?
Well, of course, again, there are so many of them. Most distinguished diplomats, of course, became distinguished because they have a very good negotiation skills. And of course, if we consider not just every negotiators, business negotiations, or everyday but diplomatic negotiations in traditional diplomacy, sometimes we could consider some big names like Prince Talleyrand, so as a big names. But I'm a little skeptical about these kinds of. They may be absolutely wonderful as a negotiators, skillful, but some of them may use a lot of this how to say, Machiavellistic approach, manipulative approach. That's not, they're not my heroes. So from this point of view, of course, we have to be very careful to name someone, but just to name few, maybe one or two persons who I admire as a negotiation professionals. For example, I could name Lakhdar Brahimi, who was perhaps many people know he was awarded in, I believe, 2002 by program of negotiation of Harvard University the title or award of great negotiator. So he was a United Nations envoy to Syria, to Afghanistan, and quite other few places. But even as again, the specifics of negotiation, diplomatic negotiation, is that you may be a great negotiator yourself, but you are acting in a very complex environment. There are so many stakeholders, so many big forces are involved. So even, for example, Lakhdar Brahimi didn't achieve much in Syria or in Afghanistan, but myself, I consider him as a great negotiator, as one of the most skilled negotiators, because I observe him in several situations. How does he do negotiation? First, it's not just, it is he skillfully use his body language, sensitivity, so tone of voice, all your body language, face expressions, your attentiveness, and softness, external softness, but internal toughness. So you need to be, as a diplomatic negotiator, sometimes externally soft, but internally tough. So experience and combining some nice stuff from the Western approach to be more direct, and Eastern approach to be a little bit more flattery, more non-direct. So all the things, I think he was able very skillfully combine. So for me, he is one of the very, very skillful and distinguished diplomatic negotiator. I think it's my opinion.
Alisher, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience. I think I learned a lot from you. First of all, we're all negotiators, and social context is not much different than a diplomatic context, right? We still need to find our way, how to coexist peacefully despite differences in our preferences.
Right.
I learned also a lot about what is important in those becoming great social diplomat. It means becoming great conversationalist, becoming great negotiator. But I also learned that I have to look at the fairy tales of my kids and look for negotiation settings. Thank you so much, Alisher, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to host you. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for being with us. And until next time on the podcast on negotiation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Remy, for invitation and a great conversation. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.